All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psych 3530. Today, we're going to be discussing Chapter 12, which is on an introduction to experiments with more than one independent variable. I'm going to be perhaps switching back and forth between what you see here as my cursor, which is a little laser pointer, and I can also have this fancy pen where I can like circle things and highlight things, for example, before we move on to the next page. So if there's a slight delay in anything, just know that perhaps I'm down here trying to get my laser pointer back or something. Okay, so chapter 12, we're going to break this into a few different sections to cut down on the length of these videos so that you're not sitting here watching maybe a 2 or a 2.5 hour video. We're going to cut this into 4 sections. So right now we're going to go over section 1, which is what is a factorial design? Well, a factorial design is the focus of this chapter, which means this is an experimental design with more than one independent variable. Now, let's quickly refresh the difference between an independent and a dependent variable. The independent variable is our grouping variable or our manipulated variable. It's the thing that makes people or our subjects differ from one another that we suspect is causing a change in our outcome, our dependent variable. Now, in the most basic and simple psychology experiments, we have a single independent variable and a single dependent variable. So, for example, maybe my independent variable is sleep, and I think that the amount of sleep someone gets is going to change or impact their GPA or their grade in a course. I think that my independent variable sleep is causing a change in my dependent variable GPA. But this very basic single independent variable design is not necessarily what we need every single time we do an experiment. Sometimes we need more than one independent variable. We'll talk about why that's the case and why you might want 2 variables or even 3 variables later. But for right now, we just need to know that sometimes we need or we want more than one independent variable. When we have more than one, we call this a factorial design. So a factorial design is very simply defined as an experimental design with more than one independent variable, so 2 or more. Now we can think of these variables really as being what we call factors or our grouping variables. Those factors can be true independent variables, meaning variables that we manipulate in the world, right? True manipulation. So maybe we create an intervention group or we create a treatment group. We randomly assign half our people into the control condition and half our people into the treatment condition, and then we see what the effects are, right? We have changed the world. We have gone out into the world and done or manipulated something. Now, these factors can also be subject variables. Subject variables are still independent variables, but they're things that we cannot manipulate about the world, yet they put people into different groups or bins. So it's impossible for a researcher to manipulate someone's sex, political affiliation, religion, or race, etc. But those variables put people into already existing groups, right? They are things about our subjects that we cannot change, but we might be able to take advantage of their natural occurrence and their creation of these natural groups in order to include them in a factorial design as an independent variable. Now, technically, they are not true independent variables since we didn't manipulate anything. We could think about them as quasi-independent variables, just like, remember, way back at the beginning, we discussed the difference between a quasi-experiment and a true experiment. Well, basically, it's the same difference here. We can have a true independent variable that we manipulate, or maybe a quasi-independent variable, which we're going to call a subject variable, that we don't manipulate, but it already puts people into separate groups. So a factorial design can have 2 true independent variables. It can have 2 subject variables, or it can have one of each. It actually doesn't matter. We can take advantage of any combination of factors here. So we're going to run through what an example might look like of turning a simple experiment with one independent variable into a factorial experiment that has two independent variables. So let's say I'm interested in cell phone use and driving safety. I think that people who use their cell phones, this is my independent variable, people that use cell phones might have a difference in their onset of braking reaction time. That's my dependent variable. So here on my y-axis, I have braking onset time. Obviously, a higher time represents slower braking, something, so we might call that worse driving. So as we go up our y-axis on our dependent variable, we get worse driving. And then on my x-axis, I see the manipulation of my independent variable cell phone use. And these might be the hypothetical results of that experiment. It would be reasonable to assume that people who are on their cell phone brake more slowly than people who are not on their cell phone who brake more quickly. A perfectly wonderful experiment. There's nothing wrong with this. In fact, it's been done before. It's in the literature. And this is great. It adds to our knowledge about things like attention and reaction time and technology and driving. Very important stuff. But there's obviously more to this picture, right? The concept of the effect of a cell phone use, the effect of cell phone use on driving is not just as simple as it appears in this experiment. There are other variables that will contribute to how good someone is at driving, or other variables that will contribute to the impact of cell phone use on their driving. The true nature of this human behavior is more complex than can be captured with a single manipulation of a single variable. So maybe we have an interest in age as well as cell phone use. We think that maybe cell phone use will have an effect, will cause an effect on driving, but that effect might differ based upon whether someone is young or old. We know that, let's say we define older as like over 65. We know that people who are over 65 typically do not have as much experience with technology, maybe particularly cell phones or smartphones. Younger people are more likely to be digital natives. And so maybe the variable of cell phone use is going to be impacted by a second independent variable, which is age of driver. So here we have independent variable number 1, cell phone use, cell phone or no cell phone. And then we have independent variable number 2, which is younger versus older drivers. Notice that cell phone use is a true independent variable. We're going to be able to manipulate that maybe in a driving simulator or something like that. And then age is obviously a subject variable, maybe a quasi independent variable. It is a property of our subjects that we cannot manipulate, but we're going to take advantage of this naturally occurring grouping in order to study it. Now, when we cross our two variables, we end up with 4 what we're going to call experimental groups and what we're going to refer to later as cells. Now, it's a little confusing because it includes the word cell as in cell phone, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Think about these as like cells in an Excel spreadsheet, right? Or a Punnett square, so to speak. These are 4 different groupings that we get when we cross our 2 independent variables. So we have younger drivers on cell phones. Then we're going to have a group that's younger drivers not on cell phones. We're going to have older drivers on cell phones, and then older drivers not on cell phones to give us 1, 2, 3, 4 experimental groups. So over here on the left, we have our results from the original simple experiment, but now we have a bit of a more complicated picture developing over here on the right with our hypothetical results from our factorial experimental design. So we can see now that we have a very similar graph. We have braking onset on our y-axis. We still have cell phone and no cell phone use on our x-axis, so that's our first independent variable. But now to depict our second independent variable, we need separate lines on this line graph. So our dark blue line is going to represent the data from our younger drivers, the light blue line from our older drivers. And notice that it results in 4 data points, one for each of our experimental groups. Here we have the data point for our older drivers on a cell phone. Here we have the data point for our older drivers not on a cell phone. Here we have our data point for our younger drivers on a cell phone. And here we have our data point for our younger drivers not on a cell phone. So we perfectly mimic our 4 experimental groups. And so what this added level of complexity allows us to do is examine first the effect of a cell phone, second, the effect of age, and then the more complicated piece of this is going to be the effect of age on cell phone use. So we're going to talk about this in much more detail later, but we call the effect of a single variable a main effect. So if we could say, what is the main effect of cell phone use? That would mean, what is the effect of cell phone use on braking without considering younger and older drivers? Like if we average these 2 lines together, if we've pretended like these 2 lines didn't exist, if we pretended like they were one line, be right about here where my laser pointer is. If we collapse these lines into a single line, and we only considered cell phone use, what would the effect be? And the effect would be the same as it was in our simple experiment, right? That regardless of age, people on a cell phone are slower to brake than people not on a cell phone. Now we can also examine the main effect of age, meaning the impact of younger versus older drivers regardless of cell phone use. And from the height difference of these lines, we can see that overall, older drivers brake more slowly, right? Their line is higher on our y-axis. Older drivers brake more slowly than do younger drivers, regardless of whether they have a cell phone or not. So that would be the main effect of variable 2, or age. Again, the more complicated piece is called an interaction. This would be, does the presence of a cell phone differentially impact younger and older drivers? I'll say that again. Does the presence of a cell phone, variable 1, differentially impact variable 2, age, older versus younger drivers? And basically what we're doing here is examining the slopes. The question we're asking is, do the slopes of these lines differ? That's going to tell us if there's an interaction or not, or give us an idea about whether there's an interaction or not. And here we can see that the slopes don't really differ. And so what that means is that the presence of a cell phone equally impacts younger and older drivers, meaning younger drivers, when they use a cell phone, they brake more slowly. Older drivers, when they use a cell phone, they also brake more slowly. The cell phone has an equivalent impact on older and younger drivers. It's just that older drivers start out as braking more slowly from the get-go, even without a cell phone. So this would tell us that there actually is not an interaction between our 2 variables. More on that later. We're going to spend an entire section of this lecture in the upcoming sections discussing and interpreting and figuring out those main effects and interactions. So if that was a little difficult to understand at your first pass, just know that we're going to go over this a lot more. You're going to get a lot more opportunities to work on these interpretations. Just know that this design provides us 3 potential effects: the effect of variable 1, the effect of variable 2, and then the interaction between the 2, whereas a simple experimental design only provides us a single effect, the effect of our independent variable. So we need to know how to refer to these factorial designs because they can vary. We use this over here on the far left of this. Sorry, it's a little difficult to see my laser pointer because the background is kind of orange. This heading design is displays the nomenclature that we use for factorial designs. So what we just had, the example we just had of cell phones and age, would be considered a 2 by 2 factorial design. So here, the number of numbers, so the fact that there are two numbers here, means that I have two independent variables. I have my first IV, which was cell phone use, and I have my second IV, which was age. Now, the numbers themselves represent the number of levels of each variable. So because this number is a 2, it tells me there were two levels of cell phone use, right? Yes, cell phone, and no cell phone. Because this number is a 2, it tells me that there are two levels of my second IV, which was age, younger and older. But if our factorial design looked like this, a 2 by 3, then what this would tell me is I, again, have two independent variables because I have two numbers. My first variable, let's just stick with our example and say that that's cell phone use. Yes and no, right, is a 2, so I have two levels. But we made a small adjustment to our age variable. Maybe we thought that young versus old is not a good enough manipulation of that variable, or not a good enough representation of that variable. We think we need three levels. So we have younger adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults. We end up with three age groups. And so we change this number to a 3 to reflect the addition of a level to that variable. We can skip down here to this big one that says 3 by 3 by 2. So what this means is that we have what we would actually call a three-way factorial ANOVA, because I have three variables. So let's think about what variable we could add to this example. I want you all to maybe pause the video here and take a minute and see if you can come up with the addition of a third variable to our age and cell phone example that might be valuable and that might actually need to be included. So let's say that we have three variables. I want you to come up with the third one. We'll have cell phone use, we'll have age. What's a viable variable? So go ahead and click pause, see if you can come up with one, and then when you have an idea, click play, and I'll continue with the lecture. Okay, so hopefully you have a really good example here for our three-way factorial ANOVA. I'm going to say that this first variable is still cell phone use. Notice that we've added a level. So maybe now we have talking on a cell phone, texting on a cell phone, and then no cell phone. We think it might be important to distinguish when talking and texting when driving. That seems like it would make sense. So I have three levels of cell phone use: talking, texting, and no cell phone. I'm going to say that this next example, this next variable, this next 3 is still age, and we're going to have younger, middle-aged, and older adults. So our 3 levels there. And then we have the addition of this third variable that's a 2. And I'm going to say that that could be daytime versus nighttime. That seems like it might be relevant for driving behavior in addition to cell phone use and age. So we could have a 3 by 3 by 2 three-way factorial design where we have variable 1 of cell phone use with 3 levels, variable 2 of age with 3 levels, and variable 3, which is time of day, which has 2 levels. So we can describe any factorial design using this nomenclature, and it's all standardized such that you know exactly what someone means when they tell you I have a 4 by 4, or I have a 3 by 4 by 2, or I have a 5 by 7 factorial design. Right? We know exactly how many variables they have and how many levels there are in each of those variables. Okay, so let's start getting into why we have factorial designs. Like, why are they important? What is this? What is this all worth, in a sense, right? Because it seems like moving to a factorial design is going to make things more complicated. It does. It makes performing the experiment more complicated. It makes performing the analyses and interpreting the analyses more complicated. So why would we want to make it more complicated? What are we getting back in return for that complication? So let's use this kind of silly example, but it perfectly illustrates the purpose of a factorial design. If I asked you the question, do you like your food hot or cold? Just, do you like your food hot or cold? Your likely response would be, well, that's a stupid question because it depends, right? Your liking of a food's temperature depends upon the type of food that you are eating. So if our outcome, our dependent variable, is food likability, and our independent variable was food temperature, hot versus cold, we have kind of a nonsensical experiment that's not going to tell us anything valuable, right? Food temperature in and of itself is not the only indicator of food likability. What we really need is the addition of a second independent variable, food type, which will help us reveal the combined and then true effect of food temperature. Now, this language of it depends is going to be really important for factorial designs, because the language of it depends is what we mean when we say that there's an interaction, if you think back a few slides ago. So what we're going to observe here is a very extreme interaction between food temperature and food type. So this would be some reasonable results from such an experiment. Notice here we have our solid black line, which will be our hamburger data, and our dotted line, which will be our ice cream data. If you eat a hamburger that is cold, here our temperature independent variable is on our x-axis. If you eat a hamburger that's cold, it's not very likable. But if you eat a hamburger that's hot, it's very likable. If you eat ice cream that's cold, it's very likable. If you eat ice cream that's hot, it is not likable. So here we have what we call an extreme crossover interaction, because it displays this it depends effect. To explain results, if you have to use the term it depends, then you probably have an interaction, right? Because what's happening here is that temperature is interacting with food type such that, well, do you like your food hot or cold? It depends upon the type of food I'm eating. And what depends upon means is that one variable, temperature, is impacting the other variable. Or maybe it's a little easier to explain it the other way in this example. One variable, which is food type, impacts the impact of the other variable, temperature. So whether something is hot or cold is an incomplete question. We need the addition of this second variable in order to reveal the true effect. And that's the real power behind these factorial designs, is that they allow us to investigate these interaction effects that emerge when we include multiple variables. Now, we could do two separate experiments. We could, if we thought that food type and food temperature impacted likability, we could say, well, let's do experiment 1 with food temperature and then experiment 2 with food type. But what that would not allow us to do is investigate this interaction. So we would have experiment 1 on temperature, and then we would draw some conclusion just about temperature. Then we would have experiment 2 on food type, draw some conclusion just about food type. And then we would be left hanging out to dry. We wouldn't have the ability to answer this it depends question, which means how is food temperature impacting food type, or how is food type impacting food temperature. The addition of that third effect, the interaction effect, is the advantage, is one of the main advantages to a factorial design. Okay, so let's just look at another example or two, just so we can kind of flesh out the details here. Let's look at a 2x3 factorial design, which is going to provide us with 6 experimental groups, or cells. We think maybe that interest in politics, which is going to be our DV, our outcome, is influenced both by level of education and gender. So maybe gender is IV1, we've got male and female, and level of education is IV2. We've got 3 levels, because remember, this is a 2x3. So high school, college, and some kind of graduate degree. And in a similar way, we could plot out those results. Remember, our y-axis here is interest in politics. We choose one of the variables to put on the x-axis. It technically doesn't matter which one. Choose a variable to put on the x-axis. We chose education level. And then our other variable, gender, male versus female, is depicted by our different colored lines. And so we could see maybe a main effect of education level, such that interest in politics increases with each subsequent increase in education level. We could try and figure out a main effect of gender. So are men on average more or less interested in politics than women? It's kind of tough to tell. They look fairly close here. And then, of course, we could try and answer the question, is there an interaction? Does education level depend upon gender? Does the effect of education level depend upon gender? Now, one thing I want to mention is that these, what we might call eyeball interpretations of these figures and graphs, is not the same thing as doing a statistical test. We're going to get to that later. Here, we just want to introduce the concept behind these types of designs. We're going to get later into how we actually interpret statistical significance with an ANOVA and an F value. And of course, we could make things incredibly complicated for ourselves, and we could add a third variable to an experiment. So here we have a 2x3x2 factorial design. We just multiply those numbers across, and we will have 12 experimental groups or cells. Maybe I'm an educational psychologist, and I'm studying enjoyment of kindergarten. Who doesn't like kindergarten? So I'm studying enjoyment of kindergarten, and I have a few different variables that I think might impact enjoyment of kindergarten: gender, class size, and the number of learning centers in the classroom. If we remember back to kindergarten, you had sort of stations and sections. Here's the math station and the computer station and the reading station and the science station. So maybe we think that the number of learning centers or stations in a classroom will impact enjoyment. And so I can break down each variable here in turn and list out the levels that I have defined. So gender gets defined as male, female. Maybe I decided that, okay, I think it's really important to have 3 levels of class size, so small, medium, and large. And I've defined quantity of learning centers as basically less than 2 or more than 2. Now, it's worth noting that these decisions about what variables to include, how many levels of each variable to have, and how specifically we define the distinctions between those levels are just decisions that the experimenter is making. There are not necessarily any a priori right or wrong answers about which variables you should include and what the levels should be or how many levels there should be. But what researchers should be doing is going back and looking through the literature, right? These, once you're to this point of designing and conducting an experiment, you should be very familiar with the past literature on this topic. So presumably, as an educational psychologist, I've read, dozens and dozens or hundreds even of papers about school enjoyment and the factors that impact school enjoyment. And so I'm going to use that prior knowledge and that prior information to inform my choice of variables as well as the levels of those variables. All right, thanks everybody. That's going to be it for section 1. We will pick up with the next video on section 2, where we'll talk even more about those main effects and interactions. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.